What do you say to someone who says there is no evidence for God's existence? In this video, we're going to give you some quick answers from Reasonable Faith chapter directors. But first, ask this: what type of evidence do you want? Oftentimes people will say they want some sort of scientific evidence, but scientific evidence is not the only type of evidence out there. We can't expect that every atom would be inscribed with "made by God with love." I don't have any scientific evidence, no mathematical evidence that my wife loves me, and yet I'm assured of her love. And so I have plenty of experiential and existential evidence for that. So, how compelling is the evidence that we'll find for God's existence? In most court cases, there is not a single piece of evidence that just settles the case hands down, but rather it's cumulative. And that's also the way it is with our evidence with regard to the case for God's existence. So let me invite you to consider some of the good evidence for God's existence. Take a listen.
Howdy, Casey Parr, Reasonable Faith Boynton Beach Chapter Director. Today I have 2 minutes to talk to you about the Kalam cosmological argument. So here goes. The argument has 3 steps. First, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Second, the universe began to exist. Third, therefore, the universe has a cause. Why should we think this first step is true? A, because something can't come from nothing. What do I mean by nothing? I don't mean empty space. I don't mean the void or the vacuum. I mean literally nothing, that which rocks dream about. As an illustration of what I mean by nothing, I would have you think of something. Anything. Got it? Not that. To think that something comes from nothing is worse than magic. B, if something could come from nothing, it's hard to explain why everything doesn't come from nothing. Well, someone might say, the only thing that nothing can produce is universes. The problem with this thinking is that nothing cannot discriminate. Nothing has no properties by which to prefer one thing over the other. Okay, hotshot, someone might say, what about God? What's his cause? Well, I would encourage such a person to go back and reread the first premise. Under our conception, God does not begin to exist. He is eternal and therefore requires no cause. The second premise, the universe began to exist. Well, modern science tells us 2 things. A, the universe is expanding, and B, the universe is running out of useful energy. With regard to A, as time marches forward, the universe is getting bigger. It stands to reason then, if we look backward in time, it's getting smaller and smaller to a point of infinite density, at which all space and time, matter and energy came into being. With regard to B, if the universe never began to exist, if it's eternal, then it should have ran out of this useful energy an infinitely long time ago. So there's that. The third step, therefore, the universe has a cause. Well, someone might say to this, maybe it's self-caused. To say the universe is self-caused would be to say that it existed before it existed, which of course is more than nonsense. It's nonsense on stilts. Okay, why is this thing God? Why is the cause God? That comes from a conceptual analysis of what it means to be the cause of the universe. The universe is time and matter, space and energy. The cause of this then cannot be comprised of those things. It is a timeless, spaceless, unimaginably powerful, immaterial being, God. Nice talking to you.
Hi, I'm Ian Davis. I'm the Reasonable Faith Chapter Director for South Wales in the United Kingdom. I've been getting out for quite a few walks recently, and it's wonderful in the springtime to see all the trees, the plants, the flowers, and the birds. Just wonderful examples of God's creation. But the universe is just as amazing as well, because the universe is fine-tuned for intelligent life. Well, what do we mean by fine-tuned? If I bake a cake, then I have a recipe, and that's fine-tuned to make a cake. I can mess around with the ingredients a little bit, but the universe is different because the parameters that go up to make the universe, such as the laws of gravity and so on, are so incredibly fine-tuned that even a small change would mean that life couldn't exist at all. Now, what is this fine-tuning due to? It could be either chance, it could be necessity, or it could be due to design. Now, as far as necessity goes, the universe doesn't have to be the way that it is. It could be different. We could vary the parameters somewhat. It's not absolutely necessary that the universe has the values that it does. Could it be due to chance? Are we in some kind of gigantic cosmic lottery? Well, the chances of the universe that we see existing by chance are so infinitesimally small that it's incredibly unlikely that this is the case. So what does that leave? Well, it leaves design. And if there's a design for the universe that means that it's fine-tuned for intelligent life, then that surely means that there's a designer. And as Christians, we believe that that designer is God.
Hi, my name's Chris. I'm the chapter director for Reasonable Faith here in Anchorage, Alaska. I have an opportunity to talk to you about the moral argument for God. I'm going to start off by reading out of Romans chapter 2, verse 15. It says, "They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their consciences confirm this. Their competing thoughts either accuse or even excuse them." What we see here is that all of us know that there's a moral law, and we know that there's a moral lawgiver. And that's really how simple the moral argument for God is. Many people say, well, I can be good without God. I'd say, yes, that's true. You don't have to be a believer to be good. But in order for there to be good or for there to be bad, we have to have an objective moral lawgiver, and that is God. See, the argument's really simple, even though it sounds complex. Many people, even C.S. Lewis, have said, how can a man know a stick is crooked if we don't know what a straight stick looks like? And that's what God gives us, and he writes us this on our heart. I've asked before to a group of believers, non-believers, and believers of other faiths, is it wrong at all times and at all places to abuse an innocent child for fun? Now, nearly every culture everywhere will agree that it's wrong. And those who don't agree that it's wrong, we're going to come to them and say, there is something broken about your understanding of the moral law. This is why we have laws where we put people in prison. If they murder people, if they abuse people, if they rape people, all of us agree that this is wrong. And that really is how simple the moral law is. Once again, to conclude, you don't have to believe in God to do right. But in order for there to be right or for there to be wrong, there has to be a God. And therefore there is a God. And that is the God of Christianity.
Is there reason to think that God exists? One reason to think that God exists is because you can think and reason in the first place. Let me explain by way of syllogism. This is the free-thinking argument. Premise 1. If naturalism is true, the immaterial human soul does not exist. Premise 2. If the soul does not exist, libertarian freedom does not exist. 3. If libertarian freedom does not exist, then it's impossible to either rationally infer or rationally affirm knowledge claims. 4. It is possible to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. 5. Therefore, libertarian freedom exists. 6. Therefore, the soul exists. 7. Therefore, naturalism is false. And 8. An abductive conclusion. The best explanation for the existence of libertarian freedom and the soul is the biblical view of God. Now, let me briefly defend each premise. Basically, premise 1 is synonymous with, if naturalism is true, nature is all that exists. That's straightforward. Premise 2 is tantamount to, if all that exists is nature, then all that exists, including everything about humanity, including all of your thoughts and beliefs, it's all causally determined via the laws of nature, the initial conditions of the Big Bang, quantum mechanics, and things outside of your control. Now, premise 3 communicates the fact that if something outside of human control causally determines you to affirm a false belief, then it's impossible for you to affirm a better belief, let alone the truth. Now, if our thoughts and beliefs are forced upon us and we could never have chosen better thoughts and beliefs, then we're simply left assuming that our determined thoughts and beliefs are good, let alone true. Therefore, we could never rationally affirm that our beliefs really are the inference to the best explanation. We could only assume it, and that assumption wouldn't be up to you either. That'd be up to physics and chemistry or something other than you. So, since we do possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm claims of knowledge, well, then it follows that humans possess libertarian free will or libertarian freedom. And if that's the case, then it follows that the soul exists or some immaterial aspect to humanity. And if that's the case, then it follows that naturalism is false. And I'll tell you, the best explanation of human libertarian freedom, the ability to be a free thinker, and the human soul is the biblical view of God. That's great reason to think God exists.
Hi, I'm Katia Rosario Pavey, and I'm a Reasonable Faith Chapter Director in Greenwood, Indiana. I want to talk to you today about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and how it points to the existence of God. And so, in order for us to do that, we'll analyze 4 pieces of evidence. The first one is, did Jesus Christ really exist, and did he die on the cross? Well, yes. We have old historians such as Josephus, Cornelius Tacitus, as well as modern scholars, and some of them inclusively secular scholars, that attest that he was a Jewish man, that he had a preaching ministry in Galilee, and that he died by crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. The second thing is the tomb. The tomb was empty at the end of these 3 days. We can see that by the soldiers going to the priests and telling them that the tomb was empty, that the body was not there anymore, and the priests having to come up with a story to cover the fact that they could not produce a body. The third thing is the eyewitnesses. We have eyewitnesses such as the 12 disciples that Jesus appeared to after the resurrection. We have a group of 500 that he appeared to at one time, so they could not all be hallucinating at the same time. Hallucinations are personal psychological experiences. The other thing is we have James, who was a total skeptic before this, and he actually became a believer of Christ after his death and resurrection because he saw it with his own eyes. And Paul as well, who was a persecutor of the church, and then became a Christian because of the fact that he saw how Jesus appeared to him as well. The fourth piece of evidence is the early testimony. So we have in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul quotes a tradition that was passed on to him, and this was passed on to him by the early Christians right after Jesus Christ's death and then eventual resurrection and appearance. And it's a tradition that it's approximately this was written about like 25 years after his death and resurrection, and because of that we can see that it was very close, within 25 years, very close to actually Jesus resurrected from the dead. So that's definitely considered early testimony. Now, all that points to the fact that these were real historical events, and even though a lot of people have some qualms about this being a miracle, well, the evidence points it to being true. And so the Bible even says that in Acts 3:15 that you killed the author of life, but God has raised him from the dead. And also 1 Corinthians 15:20, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So who resurrected Christ? God did. And in order for God to resurrect, then he obviously exists and has shown his power in creation. He has not only created the world, but he also can intervene at any point, and what we see as supernatural miracles, he has the power to do so as well. So this all proves to God really existing, and the Bible confirms it, history and evidence as well confirms it. Thank you. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope that you'll think about these things and really understand who God is and that he really does exist. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brock Organ, and I'm with the Panama City Beach, Florida chapter. Would like to talk about the testimony of the Holy Spirit witnessing in this world. I was listening to my music the other day. I love music. One of my favorite songs came on, and it was Jim Morrison's song called Riders on the Storm. And it really communicates this passionate feeling of being alone, of being isolated and alienated. You probably remember some of the lyrics. Into this world we are thrown like a dog without a bone. Everyone can relate to that feeling, but it's a feeling. It's a subjective mental state. You might feel alone even if you actually are not alone. And so the Bible testifies that God has not left his creation alone in such a state of alienation, but that his own spirit roams and moves and acts and reaches out in this world. He comes down to a human level and interacts with us in our hearts. He leads us and guides us in ways of honor and provides for us. He brings us into safe paths and is a protector of humankind. So we're not alone, at least not like the Doors song would have us think.
Suppose a defense attorney walked into the court and announced, "There's no evidence against my client. I demand that he be released immediately." Well, the judge might say something like this: "Before we do that, I suggest that we take an honest look at what the other side says." In this case, with respect to God's existence, you might believe that there is no evidence, but that says more about your psychology than it does about the state of the evidence in this case. You might think that others are foolish for believing in God, but again, that tells us more about your psychology than it does about the reasonableness of these arguments. Now, you might not be convinced by any of these arguments, and that's okay. But here's one thing you cannot do. You cannot simply dismiss the case because you dislike the evidence. That's not an option. And so I would encourage you to do this with an open mind, is consider the evidence that we presented, even though it's just sketched out very briefly in this summary here, is that there are some good arguments here that have some valid points that need to be thought through. Let me encourage you to work through these and think seriously about the arguments that are made and how you might answer them. And then, and only then, render your verdict, in this case, with respect to God's existence.